Okay, guys, just wanted to say that I'm going to try to break these videos down, the chapters down into several videos because a 3 hour long video is really tedious to try to upload. It takes a long time. It's going to be miserable for you guys if you have to sit and watch a 3 hour video. So I think most of the videos will probably be somewhere around an hour to an hour and a quarter long. That may go a little longer on certain days if I'm really feeling energetic. I may be able to just kind of plow right through. I used to, when I was teaching this class face to face in the summer with those 3 hour classes, sometimes I would forget to give students a break. I'd have to tell them, remind me to give you guys a break halfway through because 3 hours of sitting is way too long. Okay. We know that people learn better in short bursts, that if we give you too much to try to learn in a short period of time, it all starts to run together and it interferes with the learning of the information. So it's better to kind of break things up, to focus on 3 or 4 big ideas, make sure that everybody understands those ideas, and then you can move on to the next set of ideas and concepts that you want to share. So today I want to start this video by just talking about what sociology is and what it isn't. The first time that I walked into a sociology class, I'll be honest with you, I had no idea what sociology was and how it could benefit me and society by paying some attention to it. Okay, so sociology is defined in your textbook as the study of human societies and social interactions. I'll look here at the PowerPoint, and your text says specifically, sociology is the scientific study of social behavior and human groups. And that's certainly true, and that's one definition of sociology. There are probably a dozen, but they all have to do with scientifically studying the behaviors that human beings engage in and where those behaviors come from and how we influence each other, how society influences us as we're growing up through socializing us to know that it's right to do this and it's wrong to do that, and there are punishments associated with misbehavior. But are all misbehaviors punished? No, of course not. We know that a lot of misbehavior in society, a lot of rule violating behavior is not sanctioned. And sometimes it's hard to figure out why one individual might be sanctioned and another person is not. And so these are some of the questions that sociologists are looking at. And so, of course, we're going to focus on the relationships between people. Sociologists would say that family is a very, very important influencer or agent of socialization in every person's life. That can be either in a positive way or a negative way. For most of us, it's both positive and negative, right? Our parents don't always make every decision appropriately. They do sometimes make mistakes. As a parent, I can tell you that I've certainly made mistakes. I can look at my upbringing by my parents, and as loving and supportive and caring as they were and still are, they probably made a few mistakes along the way. And those things can impact us in a variety of ways. And we'll talk about some of the ways in which family can help to socialize us. And that socialization may be very beneficial to us, but in some ways, if they teach us things that are not good, if you grow up in an alcoholic family, and even though consciously you know that drinking too much is bad for family life, there may still be a compulsion to deal with stress by drinking too much, and so that behavior can be passed from one generation to the next. So you might say that, well, gosh, you're starting to sound like a psychologist, and that's probably true. There is a lot of overlap between psychology and sociology, and having a bachelor's degree in psychology probably pushes me a little more towards that end of the spectrum, the micro-sociological perspective, rather than more macro-sociological perspectives. And we'll talk about the differences between those two here in a little bit. Yes, there is some overlap between psychology and sociology. Psychology is another science of human behavior, but it focuses on the individual, whereas sociology tends to focus on how groups interact with each other, how the group can influence the individual, but also how the individual can influence the group. Are there people who have had significant impacts on your life besides your parents? A gym teacher, a coach, a scout leader, a Sunday school teacher. All of these people can have an impact on our lives as we grow up. I remember my first grade teacher did not really care much for me, and I'll tell you guys a little bit about that experience when we get to the chapter on socialization. I believe it's chapter 4. And so my experiences with that teacher and with public education was not real positive in first grade. And that could have set me on a path to not doing well in school, not liking school, refusing to study and learn the things that I was expected to learn, and rebellion and truancy and juvenile delinquency and perhaps even adult career criminal, right? And so that's how things can have an impact on us as we're going through our lives. But I was lucky enough in second grade to have a teacher who didn't seem to treat me the same way that my first grade teacher did, didn't seem to assume that I was a little pre-delinquent, and really made learning fun for me and gave me some confidence and made me feel like I was a worthwhile individual. And then I was lucky enough to have 2 or 3 teachers after that were just exceptional human beings and exceptional teachers, and they helped me to understand that I was capable of more than my first grade teacher thought I was. Okay, so sociology is the study of human interactions and social groups and social behavior. We look at relationships. We look at the socialization process. We look at all those kinds of things, how society influences us, technological changes change our lives, and so we'll talk about that. When I was a child growing up, when I was, a toddler, my parents had a 19-inch black and white TV that was the family television. We weren't very well off financially. And so I would say that we were in the working class. My dad was in the working class, made just enough money really to kind of keep things going and not have to worry too much about the bills. But there was always, if the car broke down or if a major appliance went bad in the family, it could be a little bit of a crisis, But over the course of my childhood, my dad managed to achieve a little bit of upward mobility. And so by the time I graduated from high school, I would say that my family was probably at the bottom end of the upper middle class, somewhere between the lower middle class and the upper middle class, somewhere in that range. Not so much in education, because my dad only had a high school diploma, but he really valued education. And it was always, when I was growing up, my parents would always say, when you go to college, not if you go to college, but when you go to college. So when I graduated from high school, I didn't really think I had a choice. I thought, well, your parents have already decided you're going to college. Now, your choice is, are you going to East Texas State University, which is 20 miles down the road, or are you going to go somewhere else? And so, the lives that we live, the families that we have, the socioeconomic status that we're born into, those are all factors that can influence the way we see the world and the way we subsequently act in regards to other people. So today, yes, there is a lot of racial tension in the country, concerns about how we treat immigrants who come here both legally and illegally, as well as how we treat Native American families who have, their families were here before many of us, our families got here, how we treat African Americans. And just how we're going to go forward, trying to make sure that all Americans have similar rights. I would say right now we're struggling with those discussions. But during these periods of tumult and division, comes some of our greatest growth. Just as an individual, it may be the person who just went through a horrible marriage and divorce who experiences the most personal growth in the aftermath of that. It's, as a country, I think we're capable of that as well. When we are hit with challenges and we struggle and lives are lost and people go to prison and bad things happen to not just those individuals but to the country as well. Oftentimes, the thing that really impresses me about our country and makes me optimistic is that the young people in our country are able to bring about really significant changes going forward, just as the riots that we saw in the late 50s and early 60s brought about the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and all of these pieces of legislation that created a better life for a lot of Americans, not just people of color, but a lot of people benefited from the Pell Grant program and the GI Bill and all of these kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about the future, but certainly we should be concerned about issues of are American citizens being treated fairly? Do we all have similar opportunities? I think even the people who want to deny that there are racial tensions and problems in this country today would have to agree that somebody born into a family that is very, very wealthy has advantages over someone who is born into a very poor family. Now, does that mean that poor people can't be successful, can't rise up and have success? Of course it doesn't. That's one of the things that really sets America, the U.S., apart from other countries, is that this is a country that has provided upward social mobility for lots of people. But certainly, if you're going to school in a very poor school district and you don't even have enough money in the school district to provide textbooks for the children who need to go home and do their homework, they have to leave the books in the class for the next class to be able to have a textbook in the class. That impacts the quality of education that kids have, and it can be one factor that influences them to either rise above that or to not be successful. Okay, so those are some of the kinds of things that sociologists look at: is what's going on here? How are the interactions influencing this individual? And how does socioeconomic status play? Does it play a role in it? Does racial identification, the group that an individual identifies with, does that affect their life chances? Okay, so I'll use that term life chances a lot this semester. There we're talking about the relative likelihood that somebody is going to finish high school with a diploma, go to college, get a good job, achieve some upward social mobility through their own hard work. But most people who are successful and who have had tremendous increase in their upward social mobility, the Mark Cubans of the world, they got some breaks somewhere along the line, and not everybody has equal access to those breaks. And so those are some of the things that we'll talk about. So we'll also talk about what C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination. Okay, and so the sociological imagination is defined as an awareness of the relationship between an individual and the wider society, both today and in the past. So if I were trying to understand how JackHarred became JackHarred, the JackHarred that you see before you, I would need to look at my family background. My dad, as I said, was a working class guy who rose up to a management level position. He started out running a machine out of high school, running a machine in a shutter factory. Where he was making about $1 an hour. My mom actually ran across some old pay stubs. My parents are pack rats. And my mom was cleaning out some stuff, and she ran across some old pay stubs where my dad was earning the vast fortune of $1 an hour. Well, this was the early 1960s, and so $1 an hour would a family could survive on that back then. Of course, with inflation and the cost of living going up so much, of course today we wouldn't think of trying to survive on $1 an hour. But over time, he rose to a foreman position, and then eventually a supervisor's position, then assistant plant manager, and then by the time my dad retired from the shutter factory, he had become the plant manager, supervising about 200 employees. He did not make a ton of money for that, but he made significantly more than he had made when I was younger. So I kind of went from a working class family that evolved into a middle class family. So I've seen the lives of working class people. I've seen the lives of very, very poor people who might even be considered part of the underclass and certainly part of the lower class. So I'm familiar with class struggles. And I think a lot of times when we think about the lives of people of color, we have to acknowledge that, it's not just the fact that they have a different skin tone or hair texture or something like that that sets them apart. Many people in the lower classes are of minority status, and so it starts to look like a racial issue when maybe it's more of a social class issue. Or maybe it's a combination of those two things, okay? So we can't make judgments on people on the basis of their racial composition or the country that they came from, or even the social class that they came from. We can make some generalizations, but we have to keep an open mind and say, well, just because we think 70% of this population does that, there's still 30% who don't. So, there's variation in all human groups. And so that's what sociologists do, is we study those variations in human groups. Why do middle class people really push their kids to talk about college, and maybe working class people, they want their kids to go on and be successful, but they didn't have any experience with the college experience themselves. And so first generation college students often struggle in college because they don't have the wisdom from their parents who had similar experiences when they were, college age, to fall back on and to guide them and to tell them, hey, if you're having problems with that professor, go talk to the professor. Working class families oftentimes don't realize that, if a student's struggling, go and talk to the professor and get some pointers on how to be more successful in that class. They may not think about that. They may not think that, well, you're just not college material. Well, that's not really true. Okay, but if you grow up in the lower classes, you may not have that expectation of success that kids who grow up in middle class families, that their families have of them. And so they don't know that they're just go talk to the professor, go talk to the advisors and the counselors. They can help. We've got so many support personnel. Of course, now with us not being on campus as much, it's harder to make those resources, take advantage of those resources, but you can do it. And so kids who come to college without those kinds of understandings and expectations are at a slight disadvantage to those kids whose parents went through, and even if they didn't earn a college degree, if their parents went to college, they know more about the financial aid process, the application process, and what's available on campus to help people be successful than the parents of kids who've never been on a college campus. My parents never went to college. Well, my mom went to college, but she went after I graduated, after she got the kids out of the house. And so my parents really were not particularly helpful in terms of how to deal with things on a college campus, because that was outside their experience. It's not their fault. They just didn't know because, they'd never been on a college campus. And even when, I went to college and was graduating and everything, my parents would occasionally visit campus for campus events and things of that nature, but they always seemed a little less than comfortable in that environment because it was new to them. They were, they had not had those experiences themselves, and that definitely influenced how they perceived what college was all about. And so for people who've, parents have gone to college and earned a degree, they kind of know how the process works, how the bureaucracy works. And we're going to talk about bureaucracies. TCC, as great a institution as it is a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies have certain characteristics in common that make it kind of hard to navigate through. We are working really hard to improve TCC, so to remove as many obstacles as we can for you students, but it's hard to get registered, right? It's hard to get admitted. You have to fill out those applications and send them to the right people. You've got to provide certain kinds of documentation. You've got to have this, you've got to have that. You guys have all been through the process. You know how arduous it is, and sometimes it discourages people. They're like, oh gosh, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I'm just going to give up. I'm just destined to work in a factory or in this industry or service industry or whatever, because I just can't navigate through all the hassles of college life. It is tough. It's a race that goes not to the quick, but to the persistent. Okay, and so I encourage you guys, if you struggle with registration and dealing with the bureaucracy of a college, don't give up. Persist, and let the people that you're interacting with know that, hey, I'm not going away. I'm here, and I'm going to continue to work hard. And yes, I may need help, but that's your jobs or somebody on this campus job. So direct me, send me to an advisor, send me to a counselor, send me to a faculty member, send me to a dean. Tell me who I need to talk to in order to get the information that I need and to do the things that I need to do in order to be a part of this experience where I can change my life and the lives of my family members. Okay, so enough preaching there. Back to C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination. So if we think about Vietnam, for you guys, Vietnam is just part of history, but I was born in 1965. I was too young to go to Vietnam, but I had relatives and people that I grew up with who had come back from Vietnam, people that I grew up around who had gone to Vietnam and come back. And that had an impact on our society that still today has an impact on us. The music changed. During the Vietnam, we had protest songs, and we had songs from various musicians about standing up to the government. And I'm not a fortunate son. I'm not benefiting from having a senator as a dad who can keep me out of Vietnam and things of that nature. And so Vietnam is more than just history. It directly impacts our society today. We don't have a draft today, partly because of the reactions to our society to the draft notices that were sent out in the 60s and 70s. That still impacts our lives. Yes, you have to register for the draft, but we are not currently at war with anyone, so no one's actually being drafted. We have a volunteer military. Thanks. This is July 4th, so I want to say if you've served in the military or if you have family who are veterans and who have served in the military, I respect them. I thank them for their contributions and for their sacrifices for us to be able to come to class and have this class. A lot of it is due to the fact that people were willing to sacrifice their goals and their lives in some cases so that you and I can have the freedoms that we enjoy today. So, I will sometimes say things that students will perceive as being critical of America, of the United States, and they are critical sometimes, but I love this country. Don't ever assume that because I'm criticizing something that a politician has done or our government has done, that means that I don't love this country. I recognize that this country is a tremendous country. It's the country that I was born into, and the opportunities in life that I have today are directly the country and that I grew up in is directly responsible for those opportunities that I've had. Okay. I just want everybody to have similar opportunities to what I had when I was growing up. I was sent to public schools and I got a very good education in our public school system. I was in a small town in East Texas and we had pretty decent schools and committed teachers. I was able to go to college and graduate with a bachelor's degree because my family was able to scrimp and save and put together enough money for me to go to college without having to borrow a lot of money. Now, for my PhD program, that's a little different, but I was able to go through and earn a master's degree without being thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in debt due to the hard work and sacrifices that my parents made for me because they believed it was that important, even though neither had ever stepped foot on a college campus. And in fact, my mother didn't graduate high school. She got a GED, but I always knew she was pretty smart. I never thought that, well, she didn't get a high school diploma, so she must not be very smart. I could tell that my parents were capable people who just didn't have a lot of opportunities because there wasn't much money. They were both very poor growing up. So social class is a huge, huge variable in how we experience the world and our lives. Okay, so this sociological imagination that C. Wright Mills talks about is a key factor in how we view society. And we need to try to look at it from the perspective of an outsider, according to C. Wright Mills and other sociologists. In other words, if we are a product of society, then it's hard sometimes to see the hidden meanings in things. Okay, so for example, let's think about when you meet somebody new for the first time in a business setting, and you reach out and shake their hand, they shake your hand. That's a greeting, right? That handshake is a greeting. But where does that come from? Well, if we do some research into it, we understand that at one time societies were very warlike. We had wars all the time occurring between this group and that group and everything, people conquering lands and people. And so sometimes when these leaders, these military leaders would come together, they started extending their hand to show that that they weren't carrying a weapon, that they were coming in friendship, not in some kind of declaration of a impending war or anything like that. And so that greeting of showing people that, hey, I'm not armed, has now evolved into something different. And now with this virus, people are going to be more reluctant to be shaking hands with other people, right? And so now there's some more meaning that's going to influence how we greet people and how we interact with people. But if you don't do the research, if you just watch people and you grow up and you see these two adults, meeting each other for the first time and shaking hands, or old friends who've been apart from each other for a long time and they give each other a handshake or a hug or something like that, we need to know what is the meaning of those behaviors. How can we look at that from the perspective of an outsider and come to understand the meaning that's associated with that? Think about the rituals that you go through to get ready to go out into the world every day. Well, during normal times at least, you get up and you're brushing your teeth, and there are scientific reasons for why we do, medical explanations for why we do some of the things that we do. But not all cultures do them the exact same way, right? And so if you're born in France or if you're born in Egypt, you might do the same kinds of things, but do them in a different way, do them in a different order, and things of that nature. The way that we learn to live our lives depends largely on the society in which we grow up. And so things that we see as differences, if we start to look at those differences, for example, why do some cultures eat dogs? Whereas here in the United States, our dogs are not just pets, they're family members, right? And we're willing to fight over them. We mourn them. I recently lost my cat of 15 years. Now, I didn't really want a cat, but my daughter adopted this cat, a stray, when she was an infant. And when my ex-wife and I got a divorce, she decided that she wanted to get rid of the cat. And I thought, well, my daughter loves this cat, and she comes to see me on the weekends, so I'll take the cat, even though I'm allergic to cats. I'm not a huge cat guy. I'll take the cat, and that way, when my daughter comes to visit me, she'll be able to be there and see her cat, and she'll have that relationship. And so that's how I got the cat. But I'll be honest with you guys, she had lived with me from 2011 till 2020, passed away this spring semester, and it had an impact on me. I mourned the loss of her. Just as we mourn the loss of a family member, certainly not as deeply and intensely, but it was a sad, sad day for me when I discovered her, her lifeless body. So, why do Americans get so attached to their pets? Well, they do become part of our family, right? In other cultures, that may not be the same situation. They may have had to grow up where you had to consume that protein in order to survive, and so the lives of cats and dogs may not have a whole lot of meaning in some of those cultures, except that they're a source of sustenance. Okay. I spent some time in South Louisiana. When I was a kid growing up, crawfish were something to use for fish bait, not something to eat. But as I spent, about 15 years in South Louisiana, I came to understand that that's an important part of their culture. The French Cajuns down there in South Louisiana, but you might assume that, well, gosh, those Cajun folks must have been eating crawfish forever. And the reality is that that was a strategy that came out of the Depression. People were starving, they were suffering, they were really trying to find a way to survive. And crawfish, the U.S. Department of Agriculture started giving people recipes for how they could fix crawfish in a way that would be palatable and be a good source of protein, because everybody was struggling during the Depression, and poor people in South Louisiana were probably struggling more than most, and that was a survival strategy. Okay, so when we understand that, when we start looking at the reasons behind the behavior, we start to understand cultural differences in a way that, in the past we just said, oh, those people are different from us, and they don't do it the right way. They don't do it our way. That's what that means. But when we start to understand, the root causes for people engaging in the behaviors they engage in, whether it's religious teaching, whether it's moral philosophy, whether it's a socioeconomic thing, whether it's a racial, cultural difference, then we start to develop a greater understanding and appreciation and at least tolerance of each other. You don't have to embrace other people's values and take them on as your own, but does it really hurt us much to understand why somebody might see things differently than we do, and be a little open-minded to their perspective, or at least respectful of it? That's I think that's what sociologists are advocating for, is that we respect each other. We may have differences of opinion, but we can do it in a way that doesn't demean someone else. It doesn't make them appear to be less and elevate us. Yes, somebody who doesn't eat beef at all because they grew up in India and they see, the role of cattle in very different ways from Texans who, boy, we love our beef, right? I mean, I grew up here in Texas, and I like a good steak. I like a good tenderloin, but I'm not going to say that person who says, oh, I couldn't eat another being, I'm not going to say that, well, you're less than because you're different from me. Okay, you don't have to eat beef, but I'm also not going to give it up. I may cut down on it because my doctor tells me it's a good idea health-wise to cut down on the red meat in my diet, but I'm not going to give it up. And so, we respect each other. We look at each other's behaviors and we say, well, they grew up in a different culture. That's what they're comfortable with. As long as they don't try to force their views and their values on me, they can share them. They can talk about them. We can debate, whether it's good or bad or beneficial or not beneficial, but I'm not going to force my views or values on them. I just want them to respect my rights and values in the same way that I'm going to try to respect their rights and values. Okay, so that's really, I think, what C. Wright Mills was edging towards when he talked about being able to understand how larger social forces influence us. I was just watching a video on Billy Joel and his trip to Russia back in 1987, before most of you guys were born, I suspect. And the Soviet Union was starting to experience some economic hardships and really struggling in the Cold War. And Billy Joel went to Russia, and he was invited by the Kremlin to go to the Soviet Union and perform 6 concerts in a couple of different cities. And that concert, that exposure of rock and roll, American rock and roll, to young people in Russia may have had an impact on their lives in some way. And we know that now I'm not trying to say that Billy Joel brought down the Soviet Union, but I am saying that his trip to the Soviet Union came at a time when they were willing to think about different ways of doing things, because the way they'd been doing them had not been working particularly well. And this joy that American musicians can have for performing in front of a crowd changed some people's lives. It certainly changed Billy Joel's life, according to his discussions about it. So events like that do have an influence on us, just as my first grade teacher had an influence on me, just as my parents growing up poor and raising a child that they didn't want to have the same struggles that they'd had growing up influenced my life. Okay, what has influenced your life? Think about that. For good and for bad. My parents are wonderful people, but they didn't always make the right decisions. Usually their errors were in being a little overprotective, perhaps, at least, in my adolescent years. But I did a lot of dumb things when I was an adolescent, even though my parents tried to, protect me as much as possible. So I'm thankful for their protection as well, for their watchful eyes and their rules that used to just make me insane. That I can't go anywhere with my friends, I can't do this, I can't do that. And looking back on it and finding out what my friends were up to when they were doing those things, and knowing at the time to some extent, it was probably a good thing that my parents were as protective as they were. They kept me out of a lot of trouble. Now, that doesn't mean that I always avoided every instance of trouble, but I had cousins who got into a lot more trouble. We'll talk about my cousins from time to time. I'll share stories about them and my experiences with them that hopefully it'll make things a little more interesting, and it'll show you that your relationships with your extended family have an impact on you in various ways as well, and we don't always recognize that. And that's what C. Wright Mills was talking about, is how events and people in our lives can influence us to become the people that we become. Okay. So, is sociology a science? There's a lot of discussion about this at times, and the people in the hard sciences will say, those sociologists, that's not even real science, okay? And I would say to them that, well, it's not real science in the way that biologists and chemists and physicists do science, but it is science nevertheless. Science is defined as the body of knowledge obtained by systematic observation of some kind of phenomena, whether we're talking about in a laboratory, whether we're talking about a chemist lab, a physics lab, or a social science lab. We're trying to understand the world around us through observing what's going on in a systematic manner. And if that's our definition of science, then certainly sociology and psychology and history and political science are all sciences, okay? Yes, the subject matter is different. And so we might call physics and chemistry and biology hard sciences, and we might call sociology and psychology and political science and some of those things, economics, we might call those soft sciences or social sciences, but they are sciences nevertheless. And the methodology is essentially very similar, adapted for each specific subject of study. Obviously, if you're looking at atoms and you're using electron microscopes, then the way that you go about collecting your data is a little bit different because you're looking at a different unit of measurement, and you're looking at a different phenomena, but it's science. And so if you're also trying to understand why people voted this way, or why people protested, or why people reacted in this way, you're still using scientific methods. Your subject matter is different and the methodology has to be a little different, but the overall process is very, very similar. So we'll talk about, social sciences and hard sciences, natural sciences, if you will, and the differences. But we'll also talk about the fact that we're the scientific process and statistics and all of that, the rigid adherence to different rules and ethical procedures and policies, all of that is very similar from one size to another, even though the subject of analysis might be a little bit different. So there are a number of social sciences. I've mentioned a few already: psychology, sociology, political science, economics, but we can throw anthropology in there. We could talk about history as a social science. Archaeology might be a social science to some extent as well. So there are a number of social sciences. The common thread that runs through all of those is that our topic of inquiry tends to be human beings, okay, and their behavior. So let's talk a little bit about what sociologists tend to study, some examples that they give in the textbook and in the PowerPoint is they might study how an economic recession influences things like, are people getting married in higher or lower numbers than in the past? Are they having fewer children, more children? We might want to think about how social media has influenced the rise of radical thought and extremists, and how are extremists using social media to try to recruit membership and to get support. We might look at how hurricanes or other natural disasters affect societies. So we could look at Katrina and how it devastated the city of New Orleans, and how that city is still attempting to recover from. There are blocks and blocks of missing homes and abandoned buildings in New Orleans because of that hurricane many years ago. Okay. So sociologists will tend to study the things that influence our attitudes and behaviors and the way that we interact and shape society. And those were some examples of forces that could cause changes to occur in society. So if you think about it, how has technology changed our lives? Well, think about how cell phones have become so pervasive, and how today some of the people who are struggling in our socioeconomic structure still feel that they have to have a phone, a cell phone, a mobile phone to be able to be a part of the world. And so just think about how much cell phones have impacted our lives and all these various apps. Dating, we think about dating and forming relationships. Internet dating is now the number 2 way in which couples meet other people for the possibility of forming relationships. So that's pretty important, that we now have seen geographic limits being stripped down, and now you can date someone that lived 100 miles away or 200 miles away because you met them or half the world away because you met them on the internet, and a relationship grew out of that. So, that's pretty phenomenal if you think about how couples in the past have gotten together. You had to start dating someone that you knew, that you had contact with, that you came in actual contact with, and found that you were attracted to them, they were attracted to you, and and then things develop from there. Today with internet dating, people can find somebody all the way on the other side of the planet, and decide they want to spend their lives with those people. And of course, then that has led to those who are catfishing and scamming and all those kinds of, that prince in Nigeria who's going to send you all of his millions if you just help him out by giving your bank information to him. That's all possible due to the internet, which, in the early 1990s, I was there for that. I was a big part of, one of the first users in my office at the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement of the internet, and bringing the modem in to put into my business computer at work so that I could access data sets outside our office and do research that would help me be a better policy analyst. That was all made possible by the magic of the internet. So now look how it has changed our lives in just less than 30 years. Okay, pretty cool, pretty interesting. So sociologists will also ask you to question a lot of the things that you already know to be true. Okay, why is that? Well, what sociologists have found is that a lot of the things that we all know to be true when we do the research, in fact, are not actually true. There's the surprise. A lot of the things that we know to be true, for example, this idea that males are much less talkative than females, that women just gab, 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 talk, 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 those kinds of stereotypes that we have of men and women, as males don't talk and women are overly sharing, are not really based in science. That's a common sense understanding that we have. And when we actually do research and we observe males and females in their daily activities, we find out that males talk about as much as females do, but there are differences in what they talk about. Women are more likely to talk about feelings and, things of that nature, expressive things, and males are more likely to talk about things, instrumental things, the job, sports, anything but emotions. And so there are some differences in the ways that males and females communicate, but they're not the differences that we've often attributed to males and females. So males do talk a lot. They even engage in gossip, but they're a lot less likely to talk about feelings. Now that is changing. I will tell you that if we did generational studies where we looked at my dad's generation compared to the men of today's generation, I think we would find that males are a whole lot more comfortable talking about feelings and thoughts and emotions than our grandfathers, our fathers. And your generation, those of you who are younger and fresh out of high school and entering your college careers now, you're going to probably agree that, guys today are more willing to talk about those things perhaps than previous generations. Okay, so a lot of things that we believe to be true are not true. We also had this perception that people who live in Texas-Mexico border towns were subjected to just rampant violence, and that really hasn't been the case. We actually see that violent crime rates tend to be lower along the border than in other cities within each country. So, for example, Mexico City or New York City probably has significantly higher crime rates, even when adjusted for size of community, that those communities along the border are less characterized by violence than larger cities like New York City or Mexico City. Okay, so a lot of the things that we think are true, when we start looking at the data and start looking at it more closely and investigating, we find that, not so true after all, right? So how do we try to explain what happens in the world? How does the world function? Well, we develop theories, right? We develop a set of propositions that we believe not only explain what's happening, but predict what will happen in the future, and explains what happened in the past and what's happening now in the present. So a theory is defined as a set of statements that seeks to explain problems, actions, or behaviors. Okay, effective theories should both, as I said, explain but also predict. And unfortunately, a lot of our theories have been pretty good at explaining things, but when we start trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, they often fall apart on us. Okay, so theories are always being tweaked and they're always evolving. Theories are not final explanations that will never need to be changed. They're always changing and evolving and growing as more information becomes available. And you say, well, gosh, sociology can't be much of a science, can it? Well, think about this. Has our understanding of physics changed in the last 200 years? In the last 2 years? I suspect that it has. So even the theories that have been advocated by physicists and chemists and biologists, they do change and evolve as well. Maybe not to the extent that some of our theories on human behavior change, but certainly theories evolve. It wasn't that long ago that people thought that the Earth was flat, and there are still a few folks, surprisingly, who think the Earth is flat. Although I think those numbers are declining, and so our knowledge about how the world works does change as we develop finer ways of measuring things and understanding things. We see that our understanding does evolve and change, but that doesn't render our attempts to understand the world futile. Okay, we have to continue trying to understand how the world works and developing more and more precise ways of measuring reality so that we can develop better theories that will explain it all. Okay, so where did sociology come from? Who were the first sociologists? Well, sociology is a much newer science than a lot of sciences, even a little newer than psychology. We know that sociology departments have only been around about 120 years or so, give or take a few years. Sociology as a science arose out of social philosophers who were trying to answer the question, what is the meaning of life and why are we here on this planet? What is the meaning of our human existence? And you had clerical leaders, church leaders who wanted to improve the lives of the people in their congregations, the poor, downtrodden, who were being taken advantage of by dictators and monarchs and, rulers who did not have the common people's best interest in mind. So if we think about, the theocracies and the monarchs that existed in our history, the leaders of those movements did not always value human life the same way that we today value human life, or at least say we value human life. And so the poor were seen as, well, they're poor because God ordained them to be poor. And so if we mistreat them, well, that's just part of God's plan and it's part of the way things are supposed to work. And I think today most people would say, wait a minute, hold on, let's back up here. All humans deserve dignity and respect. And we should value all human lives. And so our understanding has changed, and it has influenced the way that sociology has kind of risen as a social science. The only way you can deal with poverty and crime and inequality in the world is to understand the sources of those things and try to do something about it. So church leaders and social philosophers started advocating for changes so that the government didn't have absolute control and rule over people. The whole United States evolved out of people leaving the UK and Europe for more freedom. The freedom from religion, freedom from somebody who was going to charge them way too high taxes for very little in response. The various monarchs who, kings and queens over many, many centuries who would tax their people way above what seems to be fair. And so all these ideas from John Locke and all of these social philosophers who were talking about how a government should govern and how the citizenry should be treated by governments, and what opportunities we should have to try to improve our lives. All of those social philosophers and church leaders and the desire to expound upon the human suffering that exists in the world and how can we try to alleviate some of that suffering. That's the roots of sociology. So when people start talking about social justice warriors, yes, I think we are social justice warriors, but rather than being a term of derision, that should probably be a term of respect and admiration, because we want a better world. We want a better world for our children. We want a better world for you. Sociology is really driven by trying to improve social conditions so that the particular family a child is born to, or a particular social class that a child is born into, doesn't dictate that their lives will, end in misery just as it started. Okay, so yes, we are do-gooders to a large degree. Yes, we are social justice warriors, but rather than being a term of derision and bullying, that should really be a term of admiration, I think, because sociologists do want, to live in a better world, and for their children and grandchildren and subsequent generations to survive and thrive and have opportunities that maybe our grandparents and great-grandparents didn't have. Okay, so in the 19th century, European theorists started making contributions to what has now evolved into both psychology and sociology, studying human behavior, coming up with explanations that, the family a kid grows up in and the relationships that they develop with their parents and their siblings and extended family members and teachers and coaches and Sunday school teachers, religious leaders, all of that stuff, it all makes a difference, and it influences the lives and the perspectives that people have in both positive and negative ways, and neutral ways. Sometimes we learn something that it's not great, it's not bad, it's just kind of neutral, but it affects our view of the world. Some of the early thinkers that we'll talk about will be Auguste Comte. He is considered to be the father of sociology. Now, I'm not going to ask you dates on the exam. I won't ask you, when was Auguste Comte alive? But the PowerPoint has dates that these individuals lived, just to kind of give you some context about, when did Karl Marx write about inequality? When did Auguste Comte come up with this term sociology? And so Comte lived from 1798 to 1857. He believed that we needed a theoretical science that would systematically observe human behavior, and today that's very much what sociology attempts to do. And he came up with that term sociology, hence him being labeled the father of sociology. Okay, Harriet Martineau was a woman who was very influential as well. I shouldn't say mostly, largely, she did a number of translations into English of texts that were being written in France, and so we could, share ideas about the nature of governance and government and how the citizens and government should interact with each other. She wrote the first book on sociological methods. So she was really talking about, Comte talked about, hey, we need a science here using systematic observation of human behavior. And Harriet Martineau said, hey, I'm going to write a book about how we should do investigation into human behavior. Her work also emphasized the impact that the economy, law, trade, health, and population could have on social problems. So the root of sociology is obviously in attacking social ills, things that harm people in society, poverty, crime. If you're the victim of a crime, you know what I'm talking about. It's, it can rob you of your sense of safety and security. If you come home and somebody's broken into your apartment and stolen all of your stuff, not only did they get your stuff, you were harmed by the loss of your stuff that now you have to replace, but your sense of security in your own home now may be so violated that you have to move to another community or another home or even another country because I just can't take the fear of living in that environment anymore. You know, so crime victims certainly are impacted by crime, but I would suggest to you that criminals are also negatively impacted by crime, but maybe that impact results from a lack of legitimate opportunities. You know, the vast majority of people who are in prison are people who grew up in disadvantaged families. Not all. You know, if we think about white collar crime and white collar criminals, you know, certainly there are people who are wealthier who commit crimes, but that, you know, it's driven by the same desire for resources. You know, it's just greed run amok in some cases. But crime also hurts the people who are involved in criminal activities. It's a dangerous life. There's the possibility of going to prison, perhaps for life. You know, nobody as a 3 or 4 or 5 year old child says, "Boy, I can't wait to grow up and be a bank robber." You know, uh, they might want to be a lawyer, or they might want to be a policeman, or they might want, but the opportunities are denied them, and so they end up, in many cases, pursuing illegitimate opportunity structures. Okay, so we'll talk about that when we get to the chapter. I think it's chapter 7 on deviance and criminal behavior. Okay. So, Comte, the father of sociology, Harriet Martineau, developed that strategy for actually doing sociological research. Herbert Spencer lived from about 1820 to 1903, so he lived to be, 83 years old. He hoped to understand society better, but he wasn't necessarily trying to improve things. He didn't think that was necessarily the goal of sociology. He thought it was just based on understanding. So that's kind of a pure research approach to sociology. Martineau and a lot of the others who were more focused on trying to improve society were kind of on the applied end of the spectrum. Okay, let's take this information and apply it to make society better. Herbert Spencer, not so much. He just wanted to better understand society, not to improve it. He applied Darwin's work on evolution of the species to societies to explain how they evolve and change over time. Okay, so he was borrowing some of Darwin's ideas. And let me tell you, sociologists are shameful thieves when it comes to ideas. Okay, Karl Marx stole from Hegel's ideas on dialectical materialism. So Hegel talked about a theory or a thesis and an antithesis, and how, you know, you've got this idea that explains something, and then somebody develops a theory in opposition to that that explains it from a different perspective, and out of that comes a new theory. Karl Marx used that to explain the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, and the proletariat or the poor, and the conflict and the tension that exists between those two social classes, and how that clash can result in, you know, changes in society. And so today, sociologists might talk about the human capital or the cultural capital or the social capital that someone brings to a particular friendship or relationship. What do you have to offer the other individual in a particular friendship? Let's just use friendship as an example. Are you an honest person? Do you have a lot of money and can do fun things? Well, if you have a lot of money and can do things that people enjoy doing, and you share that with your friends, that makes you a highly desirable friend, right? But if you're the kind of friend that doesn't have a lot of money, you know, now you're not as much fun to be around because you can't jump in a jet and fly to France and have dinner, but you may have other redeeming qualities that make you worthwhile. You may be able to tell a story in a way that, you know, thrills people and makes them laugh and makes them experience joy. That's valuable as well, right? That's social capital. And so what about somebody who doesn't have a lot of resources and isn't a lot of fun to be around and is a drag because they always have problems and they're always telling you about their problems? That person has a lot less to offer a friendship, right? And so in order to be involved in a relationship with somebody, whether we're talking about a friendship or a marriage or a dating relationship or whatever, the other person has to have something to offer, correct? Would you agree? So I think, we all evaluate ourselves. Okay, I'm this educated. I've got this much in terms of economic resources. I'm not so attractive. I'm talking about myself here, but I have a good personality. Maybe that helps overcome some of those things that I don't have. And so when you see a couple where maybe the woman is really attractive and the guy not so much, you're going, well, I wonder how much money he's got to be able to have a wife or a girlfriend that looks like that. Those are the kinds of evaluations that we make trying to understand relationships. Because think about it. Have you ever had a friend where every time they needed something, they called you up and, oh, you got to help me, please help me. But the first time you call them, they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, but I just can't do that. I've got other obligations that prevent me from doing that. And then every time you call them, they've got other obligations. They're just too busy to help you, but they always want you to help them. At some point, you're going to stop being in that relationship with them, right? Because you're putting in and putting in and putting in, and they're taking and taking and taking. But when it comes turn to reciprocate, okay, so there's this norm of reciprocity that seems to be almost a universal. If somebody saves your life, then you need to try to be there to save their life if they need that. Or if somebody's a friend for you and helps you out in a time of hardship, then the norm of reciprocity says that when they need help, you need to help them too. So be careful how many times you ask other people to help you move, because if you've got a pickup truck and they're getting ready to move, guess what? Your phone number is going to be on their speed dial. So, and we don't mind doing that. And usually, I think most people are willing to give a little bit more than they get back. Where we come into problems is when somebody feels like they're giving all the time and the other person seldom returns that. And at some point, they become dissatisfied with that relationship. So that's a theory that comes from economics. If you're doing business with somebody and you're always feeling like you're getting ripped off, eventually you're going to quit doing business with that person, right? You're going to find somebody else that will treat you more fairly, will operate on that norm of reciprocity. Yeah, sometimes you're going to make a better deal than I am. The deal's going to work better for you than for me. But, sometimes I need to be able to be kind of on the other end of that relationship. Or eventually I may just feel like I'm being taken advantage of, and I may move on to form a relationship with someone else. Okay, so that's what we mean by economics and social capital and all of that kind of stuff. So those are theories that came from economics, but we can use them to explain human relationships. And that's what I meant by sociologists being thieves. We will take an idea that comes from another perspective and apply it to human interactions if it makes sense. And in terms of social exchange theory, coming from economics, it seems to make great sense. Okay. So Herbert Spencer adapted that survival of the fittest that Darwin talked about, saying it's natural that some people are rich and others are poor. I think today most people would disagree with Spencer's reasoning on that. But he's definitely advanced sociology in terms of looking at how societies evolve and change over time, and advocating for understanding, developing a better understanding of society. Emil Durkheim is a structural functionalist. We'll talk about what that means later in this chapter. But he's a very important sociologist in that he did research into a lot of different things. He did research into the division of labor in society. He did research into suicide rates and how they vary from one culture to another. He did research into norms and how we develop the rules in society, and how societies stay together. What is it that causes people to continue to interact with each other and to try to form relationships with each other in different types of society? So, for example, he talked about how in agricultural societies, people really depended on each other on kind of a personal level. The farmer down the road would help you with a barn raising if your barn burned down, but when his sheep got out and he needed to help repairing his fence, you would go and help him repair his fence and retrieve his sheep, because those were the kinds of relationships that existed in farming communities. But he said in industrial societies, those relationships are different. You don't really depend on, and you don't have the same kind of division of labor that you have in agricultural societies. So he said that there was something else that binds those societies together, because the things that bind farming communities together is kind of a common purpose and working together for everybody. But in a large city, when people are factory workers, they don't have those same kinds of attachments to each other, right? And so they have to find other things that convince them to continue interacting with their fellow humans. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the things that Durkheim contributed to sociology throughout the semester. Very big name. You heard me mention Karl Marx earlier. Some of your eyes glazed over and you stopped listening to me at that point. I understand Marxism is a dirty word. Communism is a dirty word. And that's okay if you feel that way. But the ideas that Karl Marx advanced and Friedrich Engels, his partner, his writing partner, advanced in terms of understanding the inequality that exists in capitalist societies is still valuable, even though his end conclusion that, hey, communism is going to be the salvation has not been borne out by reality. The ideas that he had about, you've got this tremendous wealth, but you've also got tremendous poverty. That's going to result in conflict, and that's going to result in problems. Those ideas still have merit and still bear us, reading about them and understanding them. So we'll talk about Emil Durkheim, who was a structural functionalist. He believed that we all have roles that we're supposed to play, and we all belong to different institutions, and those institutions affect our lives. And as long as society's functioning smoothly, everything's pretty good. But when change occurs, that throws the system out of equilibrium, and that leads to problems, and so on and so forth. Like I said, we'll get into the 3 sociological perspectives in my next video. Okay. Durkheim also advanced this concept of the term anomie, and he said that anomie was when society loses the ability to control the behavior of its citizens. I would say that the Vietnam War period, where you had the hippie movement and you had the beatniks and you had the anti-war protesters and you had the civil rights protests and the women's rights protests. So the 50s, 60s, and early 70s were a period of anomie. People were talking about, should we bow down to the government and go off to war and fight this war that doesn't really benefit the average American citizen? Or should we burn our draft cards in protest? Should we stand up against the government and say, hell no, we won't go? And so all of those, those conflicts that we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s could be viewed as a period of anomie. We had college professors who would tell students to tune in, turn on, and drop out, to go and expand their awareness by taking LSD. I'm not doing that. I just want it to be very clear. I'm not suggesting that, but there were college professors who were saying, question authority. Don't blindly do what you're told to do. Let's figure out why you're being told to do it. Is it for your best interest, or is it for those politicians' best interest that you do what they tell you to do? Okay, so you could certainly make the case that the 1960s were a period of anomie in the United States. Society was really struggling to make people behave, cut their hair and not smoke pot and take LSD and listen to this radical rock and roll music that was beginning to spread across the country. That was a period of change, okay? And structural functionalists tend to see change as disruptive for society. Structural functionalists will often look at society as being made up of different parts that all have a role to play, just like the organs of your body. You've got a brain that has certain functions that it has to carry out. You've got a heart that pumps the blood through your body. You've got the lungs that oxygenates the blood. You've got the circulatory system. You've got a digestive system. And as long as all that stuff's working properly and doing what it's supposed to do, then you're functioning well. But if one of those parts starts to malfunction, if you can't keep your food down, eventually your body starts to starve. Your cells start to starve and start to die because they're not getting nutrients, and toxins may be building up in those cells, causing the cells to begin to die. Well, the same can be true of society, according to the structural functionalists like Emil Durkheim. Durkheim said that, as long as all these different parts are doing what they're supposed to do, as long as families are teaching their kids right and wrong, and as long as teachers are teaching kids the things that they need to know to be successful in the economy, and as long as jobs are available and people are getting in those jobs and doing those jobs effectively, then society functions pretty smoothly. But if change comes along that disrupts society, then it can be a problem. Okay, so change can cause people to experience enemy and start to rebel against the authorities that are there to tell us what's right and wrong and how we should be behaving. Okay. So like I said, we'll talk a lot more about Emil Durkheim. He is certainly a very important figure in the history of sociology. Even though, I'm not a huge structural functionalist, you can't be a sociologist and not recognize the value of that perspective and the people who wrote from that perspective. Some of the key works that Durkheim produced was his book, The Division of Labor in Society, which was published in 1893. He wrote Suicide, a Study in Sociology, and it was published in 1897. And he wrote a book called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which was published in 1912. So he was interested in a lot of different things. It wasn't just one facet of society that he wanted to study. He looked at, as I mentioned earlier, I think he talked about crime and deviant behavior, and is it pathological or is it a normal feature of society? So he was interested in deviant behavior. He was interested in the division of labor in society, where males do one thing and females do other things. But then as society becomes more complex, the division of labor becomes more complex. So today, if you're a physician, you can't get by knowing what a physician 100 years ago knew. You've got to specialize. There's so much knowledge out there about how the body functions and how to avoid disease and how to cure disease, how to treat disease, that we didn't have 100 years ago, that now people have to specialize. You're not just a doctor. You are an oncologist, or you are a pediatrician, or maybe you're a general practitioner, which now if you see problems with people that are beyond your level of expertise, you refer them to a specialist, right? So Durkheim, very, very influential person in sociological history, and his theories are very valuable. We also had an individual by the name of Max Weber, and I know it looks like Weber, W-E-B-E-R, but he was German, and so we pronounce his name Weber. Max said to comprehend behavior, we have to learn the subjective meanings that people attach to that behavior. Okay, so he was saying, as I said earlier, when people shake hands, yeah, we can say, hey, that's a greeting. That's how these individuals greet each other. But there's more to that, the subjective meanings that we attach to that. There are certain signs that people can give you. This became a peace sign. This symbolized, hey, I do not believe in warfare. I want people to get along and accept each other. It has a symbol. It's not just two. Some people might see that and say, well, you're holding up two fingers, so you're saying two. But in the 1960s and 70s, that was the peace sign. That was, hey, I'm cool. I hope you're cool. There are other symbols that the fist is a symbol. The Rolex watch on your arm, if you have a Rolex, is a symbol. It does more than just tell time. It has meaning to it. It says, I have arrived. I can afford a $5,000 or $10,000 or $100,000 Rolex. Who are you? Okay, so the subjective meanings that we attach to objects and to actions are just as important as our understanding of those actions. Let me give you an example. I was looking at, I think it was Facebook Marketplace yesterday, and I saw a Lamborghini, $69,800 for a used Lamborghini that had 50,000 miles on it. And I thought, man, that's a beautiful car, but it's the subjective meanings that we attach to it that make that car worth $69,000, because I guarantee there's nowhere near $70,000 worth of materials in that car. And you know what I'm talking about. Why is that car worth $70,000 and a Hyundai Elantra is worth $17,000? They both get you from point A to point B, albeit one of them gets you there a little bit quicker, right? If it runs. So they're both modes of transportation, but one is much more highly valued than the other. Okay. If I pull onto campus in a Lamborghini, some of you folks, even though you will say, oh, that doesn't mean anything to me, there's a part of you that says, oh my gosh, look at Mr. Harred and his Lamborghini. But when I pull into the parking lot in my Hyundai Elantra, nobody's saying that, right? So the subjective meanings that we attach to things. A flag, the American flag, has red, white, and blue. It's got some stars and some stripes. But that flag is more meaningful than just a bunch of colored fabric sewed together, right? Okay, so that subjective meaning, man, we're willing to fight for that flag. We're willing to fight over that flag. And if somebody burns that flag, even though they have a constitutional right to do it, the Supreme Court ruled you do have a right to burn the flag as a freedom of an expression of freedom of speech. It's protected by the Constitution, but you're still going to likely get punched out if you do that in the right crowd, right? So there's tremendous subjective value in the American flag, in the eagle, right? Those things have subjective meaning to us. A dollar sign is more than just a squiggly thing with a couple of lines through it. It represents economic stability and wealth and power, right? So those are some of the subjective meanings that we attach to different actions and to different objects, material objects in our society. Weber said that we should use Verstehen. That's a German word that really translates to understanding or insight. And he said that that's very important, that we understand. We don't just see and observe. We need to immerse ourselves into that culture and understand it from the perspective of the people who are engaging in those actions to understand what that means. Okay. He also developed what he called the ideal type, and that didn't mean that it was good or better. It just meant that he was trying to identify certain characteristics that different things have. So, for example, he talked about the ideal type of bureaucracy, and he wasn't saying that, hey, this is the best bureaucracy. What he was saying is that all bureaucracies have these certain traits. You have a hierarchy in leadership. You've got written rules. You've got a certain level of impersonality. In other words, in a bureaucracy, I may think you're a wonderful person and I may want to help you, but if the rules say I can't help you, I really shouldn't be doing that, right? So, for example, if you go to the financial aid office and they say, well, you haven't turned in any of your paperwork to get financial aid, we'd really like to help you. We think you're a wonderful person and you're going to be a great student, but you haven't gotten all your documents in, so we can't help you. Okay, that's what we mean by impersonality. If you're sent to the principal's office, he shouldn't say, well, you're my next door neighbor and I really like your dad, so I'm not going to punish you for your misbehavior. But this other kid who did the same thing, I don't know him and I don't know his dad, so he's going to get punished. We would say that's unfair and that's inappropriate in a bureaucracy, right? In a government bureaucracy. And so Weber was just describing all of the different components that he saw in bureaucracies and saying this is characteristic of all bureaucracies. And that's what he meant by developing an ideal type. It's a model or a construct for evaluating specific cases. So if we look at that from that perspective, is TCC a bureaucracy? And the answer would have to be a resounding yes, of course. We have rules, we have certain expectations of how we're supposed to behave and how you're supposed to behave. We have a hierarchy in leadership. We all have bosses, and we answer to the chancellor, who answers to the board of trustees. And so, yes, it is a bureaucracy. There's all this paperwork that has to be done, and we have to give people what they deserve based on the paperwork that we can use to justify giving somebody financial aid, for example. Somebody has to be in need. They have to have, some academic success. We can't just give people money to, take classes that they fail all the time. At some point, we're going to say, well, wait a minute, we can't continue to give you more financial aid if you're not achieving academic progress, moving towards a degree. Okay. So Weber, a lot of his work was really kind of in reaction to things that were written by Karl Marx. And so, Karl Marx being the conflict theorist, we'll talk about him quite a bit on down the road, but Weber really was reacting, a lot of his work was in reaction to the work of Karl Marx. He published The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. That was published somewhere in 1904, 1905. It was a great book. I read it. It's hard to read. It's pretty dense, but it basically explores how the spirit of capitalism and the Protestant work ethic contributed to make the United States the kind of economic juggernaut that it became in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and has continued to this day. And then, of course, we're going to talk about Karl Marx. He lived from 1818 to about 1883. And as I said earlier, he said that society was basically divided into two groups, those who were wealthy, the haves, and the have-nots. He called the haves the bourgeoisie, and the have-nots he called the proletariat. And he said that if you own a business and hire people to work for you, then you're part of the bourgeoisie. If, on the other hand, you have to sell your labor to a boss, then you are part of the proletariat. And those divisions will forever separate you, unless you're lucky enough to become, part of the bourgeoisie at some point. So it was the owners versus the workers, according to Karl Marx. And he said that our economic, social, and political relationships allow the owners to maintain power and dominance over the proletariat or the workers. And I would say that today there's a great deal of evidence to support, the way, Marx viewed society. He wasn't right about everything, and we'll talk about some of the things that he was wrong about. And they were fundamentally tremendous fatal flaws in terms of his expectations for socialism and then communism. But that doesn't negate his observations on the conflict that exists between the wealthy and the poor in a capitalist society. Okay. His writings inspired others who then went on to, in some cases, change his ideas and led to revolutions in Cuba and the Soviet Union, Russia, China, and other countries. But communism has not, communism, at least the way that Marx described it, has not been a successful political and economic strategy, nor do I think it can be given human nature. Okay, so let me get that right out there on lecture one. I do not believe that communism or socialism, the way that Marx talked about it, is a successful strategy. So as flawed as capitalism is, and it is flawed, it's probably the best thing going, at least at this time. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't socialize medicine or socialize certain aspects of society and make society function better and make those industries function better. But it does mean that I do not believe that a fully socialistic or communistic society is going to experience the kind of economic and intellectual growth that the United States has experienced over the last couple of hundred years. So I am a capitalist, but I don't believe that capitalism should be unfettered. I do believe that we need serious regulations, and that there are some industries like the prison industry and the healthcare industry and public education, the education industries. I do believe that those should be run by somebody other than somebody who's doing it for profit. Okay, and so there are certain industries where a certain amount of socialism may be desirable and acceptable, but in the general lives of most people, that's not the case. We need capitalism to motivate and incentivize people to work harder, work better, work smarter, build a better mousetrap, however you want to put it. You know, money does motivate people, and the ability to achieve financial success is a motivating factor, and communistic societies don't have that. And I think that's why we're seeing, the Soviet Union collapse. We're seeing Cuba struggle, North Korea. Now, China is a bit of an exception, but they have allowed a certain level of capitalism into China. People can generate profits and wealth in China in a way that they couldn't have in the past, and that has led them to be the #2 economy in the world at this time. So, capitalism is definitely the route to go. But that doesn't mean that we can't criticize some of the components of capitalism that don't seem to be functioning very well for segments of society. Okay, so I'm not a Marxist, although I do appreciate some of Marx's ideas on the conflicts between wealthy people and poor people. Okay, his key works, of course, the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848. And Das Kapital was published in 1867, and they were all about politics and the economy and the interplay between those two entities. Another important name that we want to talk about is W.E.B. Du Bois. He lived from 1868 to 1963. He was one of the early black sociologists in the United States. He said that knowledge was essential to combating prejudice and inequality in society and to increasing tolerance. He advocated research on the lives of African Americans in the United States. Of course, he referred to them as Negroes or blacks, but those are terms that are no longer viewed as appropriate. So we use the term African American to refer to people of African descent who are American citizens. But he helped found the NAACP and was a major force there. And he came up with this concept of what he called double consciousness. And that is the division of an individual's entity into two or more social realities. And of course, he was talking about the lives of African Americans and how if you're an African American, you have to be aware of the expectations of the African American community on the individual as an African American, but also the expectations that the larger society has of people as American citizens. And so you find yourselves behaving in one way in one social situation and behaving in a radically different situation in radically different ways. And so that was what he called the double consciousness. And I would suggest that any person of color or any disadvantaged group probably experiences that double consciousness to some extent. Let me give you an example. If you are gay or if you're a lesbian and you are interacting, but you can't be out, fully out around certain groups, family members, and maybe you're a lawyer and you feel like if it gets out that you are homosexual, that you might be persecuted or lose out on economic opportunities, then you have to deny a part of who you are in certain social settings. And so I think that results in a similar phenomena to what Professor Du Bois was talking about with this double consciousness. Okay, so we'll talk about that more. Some of his key writings, The Philadelphia Negro was published in 1899. The Negro Church in 1903, and Souls of Black Folk in 1903. Very influential person, and you know what? Research today shows that the best way to combat prejudice and intolerance is through education. So, almost 120 years ago, Professor Du Bois, he was right. Education is a key. Knowledge and education is a key to promoting tolerance and more harmonious relationships between different groups. Okay. In the 20th century, We've seen Charles Horton Cooley with his looking glass self. We'll talk about that. He lived from 1864 to 1929, so a little bit later than some of the other sociologists we talked about. He used the sociological perspective to study face-to-face groups, such as families, gangs, and friendship networks. And then Jane Addams lived from 1860 to 1935, and she co-founded Hull House. And we'll talk about the benefits that Hull House provided in the next lecture. She also worked to establish a juvenile court system and a women's trade union. So she was trying to improve the lives of people who were migrating from the country to the cities looking for economic opportunities, and people who were immigrating from other countries to the United States looking for economic opportunity. She was trying to make their lives better by having them form unions to learn about the government and how the government works, and to try to advocate for themselves as human beings, as citizens of the United States. So Jane Addams played some very important roles in the lives of a lot of men and women and their families who ended up at Hull House. So we'll talk about that. Robert K. Merton is another theorist who has been very influential in sociology. He developed a theory that we still use to explain deviant behavior, and he lived from 1910 to 2003. He's one of the ones that lived, later compared to those who lived earlier in the history of the development of sociology. So we'll talk about his theory of deviance when we get to chapter 7 in great detail. But he was also, you heard me mention in the welcome video, I think I mentioned micro sociology versus macro sociology. Macro sociology being kind of grand theories that try to explain how society functions as a whole. Micro theories being more focused on the individual. How did this individual become who they are through living in this society? They're both important theories or levels of understanding. And what Merton tried to do is develop a theory that would link the macro theory of structural functionalism to more micro theories that try to explain individual behavior, such as symbolic interactionism. Okay, so he was trying to build what you might call a bridge theory between macro theories and micro theories, and that was very important. And as I said, his theories on deviance are still used by sociologists today. All right. Another sociologist that we want to talk about is Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist who lived from 1930 to 2002. He wrote about different forms of capital. You heard me mentioning social capital and cultural capital. When we think about capital, we think about money. We think about dollars and cents, right? But what Bourdieu was saying is that there are other forms of capital than just money and the things that come with money. There's the connections that people have with other people. Remember Garth Brooks having friends in low places? It's good to have friends in low places, but it's even better to have friends in high places, right? Because we know that friends in high places can help us get jobs, can give us good referrals if we go for a bank loan or something. Hey, I vouch for this person. They're going to pay their loan back. If that's coming from somebody who is in a high place, that can be very influential. However, if your sociology professor, Mr. Harrod, is saying, hey, I think this person's a good person, that probably doesn't carry quite as much weight, right? So that's what we mean by social capital. And then cultural capital has to do with the things that we know about the world. Do people in the lower classes know very much about fine art and classical music and good wine? Coming from a working class slash upwardly, middle class family, I can say I don't know much about wine. I know what I like. I know what tastes good to me. But other, wine connoisseurs would taste that and say, "Ooh, you just don't know what you're doing when you buy wine." And that's true. They're not wrong about that. And when it comes to art, I know what I like. But does that reflect what art critics would think is good art? Probably not. Um, And so the point that Bordeaux was making is that the upper classes can talk about the yacht club and the polo club and fine art and good wine. It's worth $2,000 a bottle or $20,000 a bottle. The best Chateaubriand. They have a language around all of that that working class and middle class people just don't understand, and that cultural capital separates us. Maybe I know a lot about bowling. I don't. But if I did, I might know a lot about bowling, but I don't know anything about curling, or I don't know anything about polo or the yacht club and how to sail. Okay. I'm not a good golfer because I didn't grow up on the golf course. My dad never has played a round of golf in his life. But if he had been wealthy, a big part of being a businessman is going out to the golf course and, hitting some balls around, swinging some clubs with other business associates and letting them win sometimes just because you want that big business deal to go through. Letting them cheat a little bit, maybe. If I've heard rumors that President Trump has a tendency to fudge a little bit and kick his ball out of the sand trap, and I don't know that to be true, but people who played golf with him say that he's not above taking a little bit of advantage once in a while. So having that experience of understanding, the business world through making a 6-foot putt, that's not available to all American business people. Okay, if they came from the lower classes and the working classes, that's probably a little different world to them. Okay, so that's probably a good place for me to stop this. I said I was going to try to limit these videos to about an hour and 15 minutes. I see by the clock that I'm now at an hour and 40 minutes and 20 something seconds, so I better stop here, take a little break, rest a little bit, and I'll come back and we'll talk about the 3 sociological perspectives. You heard me mention structural functionalism. That's one. Conflict theory, social conflict theory by Karl Marx is the second one. And those are both macro theories. They try to explain society as a whole. And then we have a group of ideas and theories that fall under what we call symbolic interactionism, that are more micro in their approach. So structural functionalism and conflict are macro level theories. Symbolic interactionism is a micro level theory. It focuses more on the individual and how JackHarred came to be the person that he is today through the experiences that he had in his lifetime. Whereas, the macro theories, structural functionalism and conflict theory, don't care how JackHarred came to be who he is. In the grand scheme of things, does JackHarred do what he's supposed to do? Is he a part of the cog in the wheels that keeps society functioning smoothly? That's the structural functionalist approach. And from the conflict approach, am I part of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat? Well, I sell my labor, so therefore I would be considered by Marx to be part of the proletariat, a worker, okay, not a business owner. All right, so I'm going to take a break, and I'll rejoin you guys pretty quickly. Bye.